Hello and welcome to Enhance Ephemeral Gaming, where today we waste absolutely no time and we jump right into 4 quick tips on how to help new and hopefully even experienced players improve at Rogue Tower. Now, tip number 1 is going to be to purchase upgrades strategically. Now, Rogue Tower's progression system sees you utilizing experience gained during a run to purchase upgrade cards of 2 separate types. Blue cards for permanent upgrades that will influence each game mode, and yellow cards, which once purchased, will appear at random during each game. You will, of course, eventually want to unlock all permanent upgrades, as many are crucial to your long-term success, such as card draw, card frequency, gold drop, and each of these are going to help you mitigate variance or RNG within a given run. Before I go any further, I want to explain that when I say blue cards and yellow cards, I am meaning the roguelike progression system, or the upgrades you access in between runs, not the purchases you make during a run. My tip number 2 will have to focus on the purchases you make during a run. This is just on the ones you're going to do in between runs. So we'll go back into blue cards. They have requirements that you unlock a specific number of yellow cards to purchase them, which makes it very tempting to always take the cheapest yellow card or upgrade possible. And this is where a lot of players have issues, especially early on in their Rogue Tower career. They pollute their pool of upgrades with the tower types or upgrades that don't synergize with each other at all. And unfortunately, this is going to be causing very inconsistent runs. You may end up feeling like your success or lack thereof is decided by random chance or early card draws. This is not what we want. So because of this, you should always keep in mind every yellow card you purchase can appear when you are presented upgrades or bonuses throughout a game. Now you can control this some with good selection when you're presented upgrades, but again, we're going to talk about that later. A few of the things that you should focus on unlocking early, I will outline now. Focus on what towers are naturally good at. For example, the ballistas have a natural bonus against health, mortars against armor, and Tesla coils against shields. I'll elaborate on this further in the future. However, just pick the upgrades that benefit the damage type you're given. Also, always pick upgrades that are damage over time effects on towers, but also in the specific bottom left portion of the upgrade menu. In that portion of the menu, it's typically below the blue upgrades. These are going to give you faster ticks on damage or greater limits on the amount of damage a damage over time effect can do at one time. They're extremely powerful, and they work well at mitigating poor or less experienced targeting strategies. Some towers will benefit more from damage over time abilities than others, such as shredders, flamethrowers, or poison sprayers, because they're good at applying a lot quickly, or because they apply so efficiently that if it isn't upgraded to give you greater damage over time, you're likely to have a bunch of damage sitting on them that will never even tick due to a cap. Also, unlocking specific towers. So not all towers are created equally. I wouldn't suggest unlocking all of them, especially early on. I think opening the Shredder, the Frostkeep, and the Obelisk, as well as the Poison Sprayer and potentially the Particle Cannon, are all good and viable choices. But things like the Radar are best left for later, and overall they kind of fall a little bit more into the just for fun category, other than a tower that is going to be used for constant or consistent completion. So let's move on to tip number 2 now. Tip number 2 is that you should understand and focus on your defenses. Now, this is going to be an extension or bonus to my statement above on focusing on what your towers are good at, except this time we're typically going to be talking about the upgrades that you can purchase during a game. So the yellow cards that you've already unlocked, what pathways should you take them in? And I'm going to give you a few of the towers and specifically discuss their best uses and upgrade paths. So let us start with the Ballista, since it's going to be available to you every game. My personal favorite upgrade here is the +1 damage to health, armor, or shield, since this unlocks the damage over time ability corresponding to that aspect. The damage is nice, but adding the ability to apply the effect is worth far more than the damage itself. I also prioritize unlocking extended range for these towers, as they fall off pretty drastically in the later game without these additions, because they're single target when many of the viable late game towers can hit and spread to multiple enemies. Because of this, my positioning for ballistas are typically regularly bunched up towards the end of my path, close to my base, close to my tower. They do the highest damage to health. We've mentioned that before, so we're going to keep going to the Frost Keep. Everything here is about the range. The rate of fire is still determined solely by the length of the path it can attack or cover. Because of this, increasing its rate of fire, increasing its path coverage is the best DPS increase you can possibly give it, with the added benefit that it does slow more enemies as well. It's important to know that this does not actually slow enemies within an area. It does create projectiles, and those projectiles create a slowing effect. I think many people who start this game think that it just slows everything within an area, and then they're very confused. Now, so these should always be placed, maximizing the length of the path covered, and other towers should be adapted to fit where you've placed the Frost Tower instead of the other way around. It can be a linchpin in creating a varied targeting zone, as it's constantly changing the speed of your enemies, allowing for better dispersion of your remaining tower's damage. It also does the highest damage to health, and we're going to move on to mortars. Now, mortars have a naturally high range, so the best upgrade for the mortar are actually the explosion radius and then any DOT ability or damage over time ability, which means like the ballistas need, you're going to take the early +1 damage effects. Explosion radius is a great thing regardless of the DOTs that you have to apply, as mortars in general have a great overall base damage output. But these should be focused in central areas to cover multiple pathways, and they do the highest damage to armor. Tesla Tower is something that I think we should talk about because they can easily feel lackluster as its base damage is quite low. For me, it's only really viable as a quick area of effect application for damage over time triggers. That being said, a critical strike build is also pretty viable, but it's harder to do. Other than that, I'm going to ignore all other upgrades from this, and it does the highest damage to the shield. Finally, the damage over time specific towers are something we should talk about quickly. Shredder, Poison Sprayer, and Flamethrower, of which I listed in order of how beneficial I think they are overall. Now, on these, you should only ever increase their rate of application rather than their raw damage outputs. Leveling will improve that enough overall, and reducing the chance to get application increases in your card choices is a net negative to your run. We are now at tip number 3. So tip number 3 is going to be shorter and sweeter, and this is that you need to set up target priorities. I see too many people who do not understand target priorities and basically just leave them alone. This is going to have a lot of negative effects, but in general, you're going to have experience gained across all 3 different damages, and this is going to make generalist towers. Generalist towers tend to struggle and fall off sharply in the later stages of the game, and you're going to notice this pretty heavily at around wave 15 or 20. Now, just to very much clarify what I mean by generalist, I do mean towers that have leveled by gaining levels or power in 2 or 3 of the aspects, like I said, health, armor, or shield. How do you avoid this when towers just gain experience based on what they're aiming at? So towers do gain experience based on what they're aiming at, so you set up appropriate targeting, which also has the benefit of keeping your towers from focusing all on the same enemy and potentially wasting shots when one tower or one shot would have done the job, but all 3, 6, 8, however many towers you have out have fired already at that dead target. So here are my basic targeting tips. Towers should again specialize in the type of enemy that they're trying to kill, and I have a couple of different specializations. I have armored enemies, set the priorities to most armor, least shield, and slowest. Shielded enemies, set priorities to most shield, least armor, and fastest. And then you have kamikaze or speed enemies. These are just the fastest possible enemy. So you're going to set your priorities to fastest with least armor and least shield. You want to be killing these things that have low health. Then I also have a tower category I consider the last ditch efforts, or the tower guards, tower guardians to so to speak. And these I target near death, fastest, and progress. Now, if you've congregated several towers by your base, make sure to drop some of these progress pieces and focus instead around a priority of most shield, fastest, and least health, or the same thing for armor. However, your last ditch tower guardians are typically near death, fastest, and progress. You can swap out a few of these for most health, least shield, and least armor, and things of that nature. you want to make sure everything's covered and no shots are wasted. But if you use the 4 breakdowns that I tell you here, you should have a very viable run and can beat the entire game with them. Let's move to tip number 4. Tip number 4 is focus on the area closest to your tower. This is a quick tip and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but always keep in mind that every single enemy will always head straight to that tower regardless of how many times your map has split, and therefore the single path directly adjacent to your tower is vitally important. There are cases for making choke points as a map develops, but I see a lot of new players and friends who try the game neglect the area right around their tower by placing too few towers or never upgrading those towers. These towers are the most likely to need manual or paid upgrades as you progress in the game, but you should never neglect them completely. All right, that's all of my quick tips for now. If you're interested in further tips or in-depth breakdowns, there's a lot we didn't touch on here today. We haven't touched on income generation or the most efficient and effective sources of income, in addition to further information or details that could be given on targeting strategies. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know right down in the comments below. And before we go, if you like the content and you want to keep seeing more from me, please go ahead and drop me a like or consider subscribing, as it really helps. As always, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for sticking with me and enjoy your time gaming.